It surprised nobody that my first job was right next to Fuddruckers, home of the best chicken sandwich ever, the Chicken Bacon Swiss, known at some locations as the Chicken Club. Next door, just for feet, was the newest shoe store in Orlando. It had a basketball court inside of it, they threw money from the rooftop at the grand opening, the local newspaper was there, it was a big deal. It didn't take long, I only worked there for 1 week, to figure out that my job was mainly to run around the warehouse looking for whatever shoes people wanted to try on. So one night, a kid, probably 10 or 11 years old, came into the store with his mother. He told me the shoe he wanted, he told me his size, and I did my job. I ran and got them. I took the first shoe out of the box, removed the stuffing from inside, loosened the laces, you know the drill, and handed it to the kid. Then did the same with the second shoe. The kid put them on and tied them up. After he walked around a bit, I asked him how they felt. I don't recall his answer though, or if he even answered. All I remember is what happened next. There was this brief awkward silence, the three of us standing there, staring at each other like nobody was sure what was supposed to happen next. That's when the kid looked at me so innocently and asked, "Aren't you gonna do the test?" I'm thinking, the test? What's this kid talking about? Then it dawned on me. Oh, he thinks I'm the shoe expert, a master of shoes. In his head, I know everything about shoes and the human foot. He wants me to get on my hands and knees, touch my thumb to his big toe, then squeeze the sides of the shoes to tell him if they fit or not. He wants my expert opinion. He wants me to do the shoe test. So what did I do? I did the shoe test, of course. I got down on my hands and knees, pressed my thumb to his big toe, squeezed the sides, the whole time trying not to bust out laughing. When I was done performing my thorough examination, I stood up and confidently told him, "Yup, feel good to me." They bought the shoes. Why are we like that? I can't be certain what the kid and his mom were thinking or how the shoes really felt, but it sure seems like they both gave me automatic credibility because of my position of authority. I was a shoe expert because I was the guy who worked at the shoe store. Why are we like that? The moment I realized what role they expected me to play, I played it. And I knew exactly what role they wanted me to play and how to play it because I saw the shoe guy do the shoe test a million times when I was growing up. Monkey see, monkey do. Now I'll assume the shoes fit that kid fine, but it's not hard to imagine him coming home from school the next day with blisters on his feet or pain in his toes. He thought the shoes felt a little tight or a little loose the night before at the store, but what does he know? The shoe expert said they were fine. Hola, my name's Jordan and I make Spanish videos, but lately not that many, mainly because about 18 months ago I fell into a hole, a grammar hole. I first started to learn Spanish on my own while studying abroad in the Netherlands for my last semester in college, almost 20 years ago. I found myself living in a dorm with a bunch of Spanish people and took advantage of the situation. During that 6 months, in addition to hanging out almost entirely with the Spanish contingent, I really hit the grammar books hard, all day, every day. But after that, I never really looked at the grammar again. Sure, here and there, and I even did a week or month in several of those immersion schools they have in most Spanish-speaking countries. But for the most part, after that semester in the Netherlands, most of my Spanish has come from traveling in both Spain and Latin America, from talking to people, reading newspapers, magazines, listening to music, and writing down the lyrics and singing the songs. I always knew that if I went back to the grammar with fresh eyes, I'd get so much more out of it, but I never did. Until about 18 months ago. That's when I started answering questions from students directly in a Facebook group, not accepting new members at the moment. Until then, to make my videos, I picked a topic that had confused me originally but doesn't anymore, and presented that topic to you the way I would have wanted it presented to me, in a way that wouldn't have confused me. So in that Facebook group, for the first time, I wasn't picking the topics, they were, and they were asking me some pretty tricky questions, many of which I couldn't answer, and others I knew I didn't answer very well, I could tell from their reply. I even hired native Spanish speaker after native Spanish speaker to help me in there, but each time it soon became clear they didn't really know how to answer the tough questions either, not accurately at least. That's when I fell into the grammar hole. Last year, after almost 20 years, I was forced to go back to the grammar books. The questions I couldn't answer forced me there, and once I got there, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. In this video, I'm gonna give you the big picture aerial view of everything I saw. But before we continue, a friendly warning. This shouldn't be considered one of those safe places. This is a real place, and even though it might seem otherwise at times, this video is about you and me as much as it's about teachers. And in the end, we're all teachers. What I'm saying is, there's a good chance that at some point in this video, I'm gonna say something you don't love to hear, or worse, something that doesn't match your current views, maybe even something you deem to be ugly, mean, or negative. If you decide to continue, I ask that you keep an open mind and remember, what we're used to usually seems normal or right, and what we're not used to seems weird or wrong. But that's crazy, it's just what we're used to or not used to. My goal here is simple, I want you to choose me. At the end of this video, you'll be faced with a choice, the Spanish authorities' world or my world. I want you to choose mine. In the next video, it's back to the shorter, focused Spanish quickies, I promise, starting with the very basics, the building blocks of a sentence, the parts of speech. After that, I'll show you how those parts of speech work together to form phrases, clauses, and sentences. If I were you right now, I'd be like, oh no, I hate that stuff. I don't like reading the instructions for electronics or when I'm building furniture unless I absolutely have to. And in general, I don't like nomenclature that makes no sense, and I don't like theory that doesn't apply to real life. But even after 20 years of learning Spanish and 5 years of making these videos, I see even the parts of speech differently now than I did 18 months ago. Like verbs. Most of the words we think are verbs aren't really verbs. They don't represent an action, which is what verbs are, right? And all this stuff I'm going to be showing you, I only noticed it in the first place because it helped me understand what was going on in a sentence that had confused me. The fact that we don't even know the basics, we don't even know what the parts of speech really are or what they really do, is a huge part of the reason the more complex sentences and topics can be so confusing. That's why, like I said, starting with the next video, it's back to the Spanish quickies. First, the parts of speech, the building blocks of language, then phrases, clauses, and sentences. In my world, I'll build a strong foundation for you. So after that, when we take a look at all the big issues, ser versus estar, preterite versus imperfect, por versus para, the subjunctive, with fresh eyes, it'll be easier for me to explain and for you to understand exactly what's going on with each. Even the big issues I've already covered, I'm gonna cover again. I see everything at least a little differently now. So if you're a total beginner, consider yourself lucky. This video is non-stop information I wish somebody had told me 20 years ago, before I wasted so much of my time spinning my wheels and wondering why. I'll be speaking English the whole time and using English examples to get most of my points across. I'll use Spanish examples mostly to reinforce an idea or to reinforce the English examples. We are going to cover a lot of ground in this video though and move pretty fast. Please don't freak out if you don't understand everything or don't understand something perfectly. Just because you don't get one point doesn't mean you won't get the next point. And try not to let your mind get too bogged down in the details. Focus more on the main idea of what I'm saying. This video is primarily about the main ideas. Then in the next video, we'll start from the beginning and take it slowly, step by step by step. If you're not a total beginner, great, even better. The more you've already encountered these hurdles and questions, the more you'll get out of this video. Because the more you'll already know, the struggle is real. Okay, here's the deal. When I took a closer look at the grammar books, and I looked at a lot of them, when I think back to how my Spanish teachers taught grammar, when I go through the websites and read the forums, I can't help but to think, wow, our teachers either don't believe what the book says and what they repeat to us, or they simply don't understand how the language they teach works. I know that sounds crazy, which is why I'm making this video, but I'm not saying everything they tell us is wrong. They're fine with the whats. When they show us a certain conjugation pattern or tell us what the direct object pronouns are, of course, they're not wrong about that kind of thing. They know the mechanics. The whys is where they fall short. When we're confused, when we ask a question, when we ask why, that's where things get ugly. Basically, whenever there's any thinking or logic involved, their view of things is nothing short of delusional. I hate that the word delusional is so overused these days, but when somebody sees something that's not really there or doesn't see something that is really there, that's delusion, right? Yeah, I mean it literally. The Spanish authorities' view of the world is inconsistent, it's convoluted, and it relies on magic. Call that whatever you want. So here we go. This video is context for the next videos. It's me presenting my case. I'm presenting my world to you. So when you're ready, you can go out into your world and look around, talk to people, watch movies, read books, listen to music, focus on the words, take them all in with fresh eyes. Then, only when you're ready, I want you to tell me, message me, leave me a comment, tell me, whose world do you live in? Theirs or mine? I started to realize something was amiss when I took a closer look at lo. I already covered my findings in depth in the video, The Thing About Lo. A link to every video I mention in this video is below this video or in the description. In short, the Spanish authority tells us lo has so many different meanings. First, they tell us that lo is a direct object pronoun and means it or him, except in most parts of Spain where lo only means it. And separately from that, they tell us the word que without the accent means that. Okay, so far so good. But then they don't even tell us this. We just see examples of lo and que together as lo que, and it's translated as what, that which, whatever, whichever, and a bunch of other stuff. And we're like, what? So instead of memorizing or practicing whatever we need to memorize or practice, we waste time asking questions like, how does lo que suddenly mean what? I know que with the accent means what. Does that have anything to do with this? If so, lo just means nothing, then why do we say it? When do we say lo and when don't we? Sadly, we never get an answer to any of these questions. They don't even attempt to explain how this magic works or how the two situations are connected. That, in reality, words don't mean words. Words don't have specific set meanings like we're led to believe. In real life, each word represents some central core idea, or once in a while, ideas. But that creates a problem. The only way we can talk about words is with words. So yeah, the key is to remember there's almost always another way to describe the same word, and there's almost always another word to describe that same idea. That's why to eat, snack, nosh, munch, and nibble could all be translated in Spanish as comer, comer, which just means to eat. Yes, these verbs all do imply a subtly different type of eating, but big picture, they all still mean to eat. There's major overlap between the meanings of all these verbs. They can all be used in the same situation, so they can all mean the same thing. Back to lo now. The central core idea of lo is the thing. That's the idea that lo really represents. Then it and him are just two different ways to say the thing. They're two different translations of the thing. It's easy to see right away with it. I see it, I see the thing. These two sentences mean the same thing. Then with him, I know we say that nouns are people, places, and things, but really, people and places are just two specific types of things. We don't normally refer to people as things though, it's not polite, but we are things. I see him, I see the thing. These two sentences mean the same thing. They're two different ways to express the same idea, and manners aside, they could both be said in the same situation. It becomes clearer when we're talking about animals and pets, because the line between them is hazier. We typically refer to an animal that's a pet as him or her, but we normally refer to an animal that's not a pet as it. Our relationship with the animal determines whether we refer to the animal as him and her or it. The difference is only in our minds. Plus, in Spanish, I see it is lo veo, I see him is lo veo, and I see the thing is lo veo. I'm telling you, lo really means the thing, then it and him are just two different translations of the thing, which explains why lo que can mean what, that which, whatever, or whichever, among other things. Since lo means the thing and que, without the accent, means that, logically, lo que really means the thing that. What, that which, whatever, and whichever are all just different ways to say the thing that. They're different translations of the thing that. If you're sitting at a table making something, I could say to you, I like what you're making. I like that which you're making. I like whatever you're making. I like whichever you're making. Or I like the thing that you're making. All these sentences could be said in the same situation. They can all mean the same thing. And in Spanish, they can all be translated the same way. Me gusta lo que haces. No magic involved. Why do they do that? Why do they show us all the different uses of lo, all the different translations of lo, then never show us the context that connects all the different situations logically? I couldn't stop to think about the answers to these questions though. I had other things on my mind. Upon seeing that lo always means the thing, I next set my sights, with fresh eyes, on se, and I reported my findings to you in the videos Se is a monster, monsters aren't real, and going on a se hunt. The Spanish authority tells us, oh, there are so many different ses. There's normal reflexive se, reciprocal se, passive se, impersonal se, and at least 2 or 3 more. But again, they don't even attempt to explain or connect all these different ses. They don't tell us that, except sometimes when it's part of a double object pronoun, there's only one se, and it always tells us the same thing. I've refined how I say this since I made those videos, but se always tells us that clause or sentence refers back to the subject at some point in some way. Normal reflexive. What I mean is, when a clause or sentence contains se, either the subject and the direct object both represent the same noun in reality, or the subject and the indirect object both represent the same noun in reality, or the subject and a prepositional object both represent the same noun in reality. And what that means is, se either represents the direct object, se represents the indirect object, or se represents a prepositional object. Regardless though, se represents the same noun in reality as the subject represents. The clause or sentence refers back to the subject at some point in some way. I'll show you examples of what I'm talking about in a few minutes. For now, just know all their different ses are really just normal reflexive se in different situations, in different contexts. In Spanish, they say se every time. It's only the English that changes from situation to situation. Why do they do that? Why do they show us all the different situations se is used in, but never show us the context that connects the different situations logically? Why wouldn't they at least tell us, but really remind us constantly, that even though se does something a little different in each of these situations, it still does the same thing every time? We'd never do that to somebody in real life. If we were teaching a kid about all the different types of fruits, we wouldn't tell them, well kids, there are grapes, strawberries, oranges, peaches, red apples, green apples, yellow apples, and pink apples. That would make it seem like all the different types of apples are completely different fruits, which in a way they are, but in another way they're not, which is the whole point. If we sensed for 1 second that the kids thought red apples and green apples are totally different fruits, like apples and oranges are totally different fruits, we'd feel compelled immediately to help them understand the reality of the situation, that it depends on the context. Yes, red apples and green apples are totally different, but they're also the same. Why would the Spanish authority do that to us with se? Why would they go out of their way to make it it seem like red apples and green apples are completely different fruits, but never point out that they're both still apples. I still had no time for such questions though. My schedule just filled up. With the momentum I had coming from lo and sa, and with my fresh eyes, it was finally time to tackle the subjunctive, an understanding of which had eluded me for almost 20 years. I shared the highlights of my findings with you in last year's State of the Gringo address. Do you know what the subjunctive is? Obviously, each verb has a set of conjugations in each verb tense. Well, the subjunctive is more than just another verb tense. It's a whole other set of verb tenses. There are the normal verb tenses, then there are the subjunctive verb tenses. Luckily, though, there aren't as many subjunctive verb tenses as there are normal verb tenses. So, just like each verb has a set of conjugations in each normal verb tense, each verb also has a set of conjugations in each subjunctive verb tense. But memorizing all the new conjugations isn't the hard part, or it's not the hardest part. The hardest part is deciding when to use the subjunctive and when not to, when to use a normal verb conjugation in a particular sentence, and when to use a subjunctive verb conjugation. The Spanish authority tells us, oh, the subjunctive has so many different causes. Then they list all their different causes for us. And to help us remember all their causes, they give us a bunch of acronyms where each letter stands for a cause or causes, the most common of which is probably weirdo. They also go on and on about these so-called triggers, words and phrases they claim trigger the subjunctive, just another word for cause basically. But surprise, surprise, never once do they even try to connect all their different causes and triggers logically. The problem is, it all makes sense when we see their simple, hand-picked examples in the book or in class, but the second we hit the real world, it all falls apart. They tell us that emotions and doubt cause the subjunctive, but then we see sentences all over the place that convey emotion and doubt but don't use the subjunctive. Same with their triggers. We see sentences all the time that contain a word or phrase that supposedly triggers the subjunctive in sentences without the subjunctive. When I finally took a closer look at the subjunctive, I didn't see a bunch of different causes. I saw only one cause, an uncertainty of completion between two clauses. With a rare exception, the subjunctive is only used in sentences with two clauses or more, two verbs or more, and the one true cause of the subjunctive is an uncertainty of completion between those two clauses. So, when the subject in one clause isn't sure or can't be sure that the verb in a second clause will happen, an uncertainty of completion, that verb gets conjugated in the subjunctive. When we're not sure or can't be sure a verb will happen, we conjugate that verb in the subjunctive. In reality, their causes and triggers aren't always causes and triggers, so they're not really causes and triggers. This is one of those correlation doesn't imply causation situations. Their causes and triggers only seem like they're causes and triggers in sentences where there's also an uncertainty of completion between two clauses, the one true cause of the subjunctive. For example, in the weirdo acronym, the W stands for wishes and the R stands for recommendations. They're saying wishes and recommendations cause the subjunctive to be used. And I agree, the subjunctive is used with wishes and recommendations, either most of the time or always even. But that's only because when we wish for something to happen, we can't be sure it'll actually happen, an uncertainty of completion. And when we recommend for somebody to do something, we can't be sure they'll actually do it, an uncertainty of completion. But if we just memorize W for wishes and R for recommendations without understanding the logic of why the subjunctive is really being used, an uncertainty of completion, what about demands, commands, orders, and who knows what else? The subjunctive is usually used with demands, commands, and orders for the same reason. When we demand, command, or order somebody to do something, we can't be sure they'll actually do it, an uncertainty of completion. At least with wishes and recommendations though, we really do use the subjunctive most of the time, if not always. The same can't be said for emotions and doubt, the E and D in weirdo. Again, we see sentences all the time that convey emotion and doubt, some with the subjunctive and some without the subjunctive. I'm happy that you're smiling. I'm happy when you're smiling. Both these multiple clause sentences convey emotion, I'm happy. And they're exactly the same sentence too, aside from the conjunction connecting the two clauses in each sentence, that versus when. In Spanish though, the first example would be translated with the subjunctive, estoy feliz de que estés sonriendo. Estés is a subjunctive conjugation of estar, but the second example would be translated without the subjunctive, estoy feliz cuando estás sonriendo. Estás is a normal conjugation of estar. Both these sentences convey emotion. One uses the subjunctive, but the other doesn't. Emotions don't cause the subjunctive, and neither does doubt. I'm not sure that Jimmy is coming today. I'm not sure if Jimmy is coming today. Again, both these multiple simple clause sentences convey doubt, I'm not sure, and again, they're exactly the same sentence except for the conjunction connecting the two clauses in each sentence, that versus if. In Spanish, though, the first example would be translated with the subjunctive, no estoy seguro de que Jimmy venga hoy. Venga is a subjunctive conjugation of venir, but the second example would be translated without the subjunctive, no estoy seguro si Jimmy viene hoy, or no estoy seguro si Jimmy vendrá hoy. Viene and vendrá are both normal conjugations of venir. Both these sentences convey doubt. One uses the subjunctive, but the other one doesn't. Plain old doubt doesn't cause the subjunctive either. Why do they do that? The way they present their causes and triggers as actually being causes and triggers really messes with our minds. It makes the subjunctive harder to learn, not easier. That's why I'm constantly getting emails like this one. Why does this example use the subjunctive? I thought there always needed to be a trigger word or phrase. I don't see any of those feeling mood words that trigger the subjunctive. And it's not his fault. I used to ask those same questions myself. The Spanish authority tells us words like esperar or cuando are trigger words, then we see sentences everywhere with esperar and cuando but no subjunctive. Or we see a sentence that contains the subjunctive but no trigger, and we waste our time freaking out about nothing. Now, in their defense, they do sometimes admit that their causes and triggers aren't always causes and triggers, but only once usually, quickly, in passing, then never again. This is one of the most popular and authoritative Spanish websites. I use this website myself on a regular basis. Right away, in the headline, it says words and phrases that trigger the subjunctive or indicative. Then down here, certain words or phrases trigger the use of each mood. They basically repeat the same thing here and here. Then finally, they use the word tend here, but then it's right back to tables of words and phrases that trigger the subjunctive. Same thing again here and here and here. Then they have the audacity to post memes like this one. I saw this on some Facebook teacher page I'm a fan of. Stop saying they didn't teach that in school. Yes, they did. You were talking. Oh, really, the Spanish authority? Did you tell us that lo always means the thing? Did you tell us that se always does the same thing? Did you tell us that there's only one true cause of the subjunctive? I didn't have time to wait for their answers, though. I had something more important to tend to. I smelled blood in the water. What is learning? I've thought about that question a lot since I started making Spanish videos. Sometime within the first few years, I settled on this definition. Learning is giving context to new information as we encounter it. How does this new information fit in with all the information we've already encountered? How does it contradict it? Learning isn't just memorizing a bunch of independent statements in isolation. Learning is giving context to those statements. Then, at some point, while lost in the grammar hole, I realized something else, something connected to that. Context is reality. And if context is reality, that means a lack of context or missing context is not reality. I mean that in several ways. At the shoe store that night, both the kid and his mother thought that I was a shoe expert because they didn't have enough context. They didn't know the reality of the situation, that this shoe expert had worked there less than a week, and the only training I received on the shoes was how to find them in the warehouse. Lo has so many different meanings. There are so many different ses. The subjunctive has so many different causes. Those are all contextual if-then statements without the context. They're only true when presented with the proper context, that all those different meanings of lo are just different translations of the thing, that all those different ses all tell us the same thing, that their causes are only causes when there's also an uncertainty of completion. The Spanish authority presents them without their context though. Context is reality, and a lack of context or missing context is not reality. What they tell us about lo, se, and the subjunctive simply doesn't reflect reality. It's weird, aren't they the ones that used to get mad at us in math class for not showing our work? But it's okay for them to tell us that lo goes from meaning it or him and ke goes from meaning that to lo ke meaning what with zero explanation by some sort of magic. Then their default knee-jerk reaction whenever we say you never told us that is it's our fault for not listening. What's wrong with them? Why do they do that? Why are they like that? But wait a second, with se and the subjunctive specifically, looking back, I never understood what the heck they were saying when they were talking about all the different ses or all their subjunctive causes and triggers. I never bought into any of it. At the time, I thought it was my fault. I wasn't patient enough. I wasn't focused enough. But now that I've seen that it's all worthless, that none of it is true, what else have they told us that isn't true? What else did I never buy into? What else has been haunting me for decades? Just then, two words popped into my mind: transitive and intransitive. Oh lordy lordy, game on. When I finally, calmly, systematically took a look at what transitive and intransitive verbs actually are, I came to this conclusion. The terms transitive and intransitive have absolutely zero relation to reality. In the real world, intransitive verbs aren't really a thing. The Spanish authority tells us when a clause or sentence contains a direct object, the verb in that clause or sentence is transitive. Then they tell us when a clause or sentence doesn't contain a direct object, the verb in that clause or sentence is intransitive. So, according to them, when there's a direct object, the verb is transitive, and when there's not a direct object, the verb is intransitive. But in reality, there's always a direct object. On planet Earth, when some action is performed, when a verb is done, somebody or something has to do that verb, the subject. And when any verb is done, somebody or something has to get that verb done to them, or to it, the direct object. So, the subject does the verb, and the direct object gets the verb done to it. Jimmy speaks Spanish. The subject is Jimmy, he does the speaking, the verb is speaks, the direct object is Spanish. That's what gets spoken. The subject does the verb to the direct object. Jimmy speaks Spanish. In reality, that's how it always goes. Once there's a verb, there has to be a subject and there has to be a direct object. Spanish can't be spoken by nobody, can it? Somebody or something has to speak it. There has to be a subject. And Jimmy can't speak nothing. That's not how speaking works. When Jimmy speaks, he has to speak or say something. There has to be a direct object. I'm not saying this is some rule or law. After looking at hundreds and hundreds of examples, if not thousands, I'm simply saying it's my observation. In reality, once there's a verb, there's always a subject and there's always a direct object. Where things get tricky is when we're just speaking normally, we often omit the subject or direct object from our sentences, or both. It's just so normal for us though, most of the time we don't even realize we're doing it. We see an example of this right away when we start learning Spanish. You know how in Spanish, if the context allows it, we can completely omit the subject? Jimmy speaks Spanish could be Jimmy habla español, but if you already know that I'm talking about Jimmy, I could just say habla español. I didn't say Jimmy, I omitted the subject. But that doesn't mean in reality there's no subject. Jimmy didn't just disappear. I'm pretty sure the laws of physics, on planet Earth at least, don't allow for that kind of thing to happen. It just means I omitted the subject. This sentence is missing its subject. Because of my normal human logic and the context, you already knew I was talking about Jimmy, I knew I didn't have to say Jimmy and you'd still know I was talking about Jimmy. Because you had the same context and you have the same normal human logic I have. Remember, context is reality and a lack of context or missing context is not reality? Well, this is a whole other kind of missing context, a more important kind of missing context, a more consequential kind. When we're learning Spanish, most of the confusing sentences are missing context. They're missing their subject, they're missing their direct object, they could even be missing their verb. Sentences with missing context confuse us because they don't match reality. Something's there in reality that isn't being accounted for in the sentence. So whenever we're confused and the sentence is missing context, our fastest path to clarity is to fill it back in. We need to identify the missing context and fill in the missing context. For example, habla español. In this sentence, the verb is habla and the direct object is español. That's what gets spoken. No subject. This sentence is missing its subject, so our job is to fill it in. I only said habla español because I knew that you knew that I was talking about Jimmy. So from the context, we know that habla español, missing subject, really means Jimmy habla español, no missing subject. When filling in missing context, our first option is to use whatever context we do have, either from a previous sentence, from a previous conversation, or from our five senses, our eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and touch. But even when we don't have any context, when we see something like habla español, we still know that's missing its subject. Not only because there's always a subject, but because Spanish can't be spoken on its own. Somebody or something has to speak it, so we just say that. Habla español, missing subject, really means alguien habla español. Somebody speaks Spanish, no missing subject. Or it could mean una persona habla español. A person speaks Spanish. Or él or ella habla español. He or she speaks Spanish. All of these statements have to be true, and there's no missing subject in any of them. When filling in missing context, when we don't have any normal context, our second option is to use what I call default context. By default, when something is told, somebody has to tell it, or a person has to tell it, or he or she has to tell it. That's the default context for this sentence. Have you ever wondered why in Spanish, when talking about the weather, they say hace frío when we say it is cold, and they say hace calor when we say it is hot? They use the verb hacer, which normally means to make or to do, while in English, we use the verb to be. Why do they use hacer in this context? Makes cold, makes hot, huh? It makes itself? This is one of the most common questions I get, and until recently, I didn't have an answer. I knew this was something I had to take a closer look at. So I finally took a closer look with fresh eyes. It is cold. Hace frío. The verb is hace from hacer, and the direct object is frío. That's one big difference difference between the English and Spanish in this context. The word frío is being used as a noun here. It's el frío. That means coldness, basically. I don't see a subject. This sentence is missing its subject. And the second I filled it in with default context, I saw right away, for the first time, what was going on. I saw the logical explanation for why, when talking about the weather, they say hace frío and hace calor when we say it is cold and it is hot. What's the missing subject? Who or what is making coldness or heat? Who or what could possibly make the world cold or hot? That's when it hit me. There's only one somebody or something that could make all the air around us cold or hot. The big man upstairs, Mr. G-O-D. I'm not religious myself, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. Spanish developed a long time ago when I assume most people not only believed in God, but believed that God was responsible for the weather, that God was responsible for the coldness and the heat, that God makes coldness, that God makes heat or warmth. I guess the fact that when there's coldness, God made the coldness, and when there's heat, God made the heat, back in the day, that was so so default, at some point, they stopped mentioning God every single time. Everybody knew who makes coldness and who makes heat. So now when we see hace frío and hace calor, we don't have to waste our time being confused anymore. We don't have to waste another second wondering why. Hace frío and hace calor, missing subject, really mean él hace frío and él hace calor, or Dios hace frío and Dios hace calor. And the way we got here was, we just identified the missing context and filled it in, using nothing more than our normal human logic and the default context of the situation. Plus, as my dad recently pointed out, in French, they say the same thing basically, but they don't omit the subject so it's easier to see what's going on. In French, they say il fait froid when we say it is cold, and they say il fait chaud when we say it is hot or warm, but they pronounce the words correctly. More literally, these French sentences mean it or he makes coldness, and it or he makes heat or warmth, just like in Spanish. Are you starting to see why missing context is a problem, and how filling it in is the solution? When we're confused, there's almost always missing context. So when we're confused, identifying and filling in the missing context is our fastest path to not being confused. We started talking about missing context in the first place, though, because of missing direct objects, not missing subjects. Remember the transitive-intransitive thing? I said the terms transitive and intransitive have absolutely zero relation to reality, because in reality, there's always a direct object, so intransitive verbs can't really be a thing. Say there's some drama going down with our friends Gimme and Kimmy, and we've both known for a while that Gimme is thinking about telling Kimmy the truth. Well, I just got off the phone with Gimme, and I have an update for you. I could say to you, Gimme told Kimmy the truth. The subject is Gimme, that's who did the telling. The verb is told. The direct object is the truth, that's what got told. Then Kimmy is an indirect object, because Kimmy is who received the direct object. Kimmy received the truth. So the subject does the verb, the direct object gets the verb done to it, and the indirect object, when there is one, receives the direct object. But since you've known for a while that Gimme was thinking about telling Kimmy the truth, I could just tell you Gimme told Kimmy. This time I omitted the direct object. I omitted the truth. But just because I omitted the direct object from the sentence doesn't mean poof, it's gone from reality. Gimme couldn't have told Kimmy nothing. It just means this sentence is missing its direct object. When I said Gimme told Kimmy, my human logic told me I didn't have to say the truth. I knew you had the same human logic I have and would still know I was talking about the truth. That Gimme told Kimmy, missing direct object, really means Gimme told Kimmy the truth, no missing direct object. Even when we don't have any normal context though, there's always default context. If we have no clue who Gimme and Kimmy are, when we see something like Gimme told Kimmy, we still know that's missing its direct object, not only because there's always a direct object, but because Gimme had to have told Kimmy something. So again, we just say that. Gimme told Kimmy, missing direct object, really means Gimme told Kimmy something, no missing direct object. The direct object is something. Or we could say Gimme told Kimmy words, no missing direct object, now the direct object is words. Both these statements have to be true. You know how sometimes we understand all the vocab and grammar in a sentence, but still don't know who or what is doing what to whom or what? We think we have a sentence construction problem, and we do, but really we have a missing context problem. A huge percentage of the missing direct objects out there are caused by two groups of verbs that I call bodily movement verbs and existential verbs. Both groups work almost exactly the same, but they are a little different, so we'll start with bodily movement verbs. We do bodily movement verbs to ourselves, and to do them, we don't need to involve anything else or anybody else. We just need to move our bodies. So with bodily movement verbs, where the noun that does the verb, where the subject, and where the noun that gets the verb done to it, where the direct object. For example, the verb to sit is usually usually used as a bodily movement verb. When we sit, we just need to move our bodies. We do the verb to ourselves. When we sit ourselves. We do the sitting, we're the subject, but we also get the sitting done to us, we're the direct object. Jimmy sits in a chair. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is sits, then in a chair is called a prepositional object phrase or prepositional object. We'll talk about prepositional objects in a future video. For now, what's important is this sentence is missing its direct object because to sit is a bodily movement verb, and with bodily movement verbs, it's so default that the direct object is the subject, we typically don't say the direct object every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. They'll know that Jimmy sits in a chair, missing direct object, really means Jimmy sits himself in a chair, no missing direct object. Because that's the default. When we sit ourselves. This is another example of default context. In English, when the verb is a bodily movement verb, we almost always omit the direct object. But not always. I remember teachers telling me all the time, Jordan, you sit yourself in that chair right now. They said you sit yourself. We don't always omit the direct object with bodily movement verbs in English, just almost always. And we wonder why in Spanish, Jimmy sits in a chair is translated as Jimmy se sienta en una silla, which is the equivalent of Jimmy sits himself in a chair. Well, this is why. In English, we usually omit the direct object with to sit. Jimmy se sienta en una silla. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is sienta, from sentar, which means to sit. The direct object is se. In this example, se means himself. Then en una silla is a prepositional object phrase. It means in a seat. Oh, this is our first example with se. Remember, except sometimes when it's part of a double object pronoun, se tells us this sentence refers back to the subject at some point in some way. Well, when the verb is a bodily movement verb, se specifically tells us this sentence refers back to the subject at the direct object. With bodily movement verbs, se is the direct object. Again, in this example, se means himself. I call this the language of reality. When a sentence is missing context, that's not reality. But when we fill in the missing context, we make it so the words of the sentence do match reality. What's cool is when we rewrite English and Spanish sentences in the language of reality, not only do we make the sentences match reality, we make them match each other. Jimmy sits in a chair. That's missing context. It doesn't match reality. And it doesn't match the Spanish either. Jimmy se sienta en una silla. They say the direct object, we don't. But once we fill in the missing direct object, once we rewrite the English sentence in the language of reality, Jimmy sits himself in a chair, not only does that match reality word for word, it matches the Spanish translation word for word. Cool, right? Another verb that's commonly used as a bodily movement verb is to go. This is gonna seem weird at first, but just remember, when we're used to something, it seems normal or right, and when we're not used to something, it seems weird or wrong. In reality, when we go somewhere, all we have to do is move our bodies. We just need to take ourselves there. When we go, we do the verb to ourselves. We do the going, we're the subject, and we get the going done to us, we're the direct object. Sure, these days we usually take a bike, car, bus, train, or airplane to go most places, but we don't have to, we're just lazy. Just kidding. But technically, we could walk or swim to any location on planet Earth. It's just not practical most of the time, and we die on the way to most places. Jimmy goes to the beach. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is goes, then to the beach is a prepositional object phrase. This sentence is missing its direct object. That's because, in this example, goes is being used as a bodily movement verb, and with bodily movement verbs, it's so default that the direct object is the subject, we typically omit the direct object. But in the language of reality, Jimmy goes to the beach, missing direct object, means Jimmy himself goes to the beach, no missing direct object. Or Jimmy goes himself to the beach, still no missing direct object. Neither of these translations are necessarily telling us that Jimmy goes to the beach all alone, though they could be saying that too. All we know for sure is Jimmy personally goes to the beach, or Jimmy goes personally to the beach. Like, Jimmy went to the beach? No way. I can't believe that. He must have sent somebody in his place. No sirree, Bob. Jimmy himself went to the beach. Jimmy went himself to the beach. And again, we wonder why in Spanish, Jimmy goes to the beach is often translated as Jimmy se va a la playa, the equivalent of Jimmy himself goes to the beach, or Jimmy goes himself to the beach. But really, the better question is, why don't we say himself in English? That's what matches reality better. In this sentence, the subject is Jimmy, the verb is ba, from ear, the direct object is se. In this case, it again means himself. Remember, with bodily movement verbs, se tells us specifically the clause or sentence refers back to the subject at the direct object. With bodily movement verbs, se is the direct object. We do bodily movement verbs to ourselves. Now, you will also see Jimmy goes to the beach translated as just Jimmy va a la playa, without se. But when you do, that just means they omitted the direct object in Spanish like we do in English. They omitted se. In English, with the verb to go, we almost always omit the direct object. In Spanish, with the verb ir, sometimes they omit the direct object, sometimes they don't. don't. This example shows us how hard it can be sometimes to differentiate between the words in a sentence and what's actually happening in reality. We're so used to talking the way we talk until we go to learn a second language, we don't even realize there is a difference between the words in a sentence and reality. Okay, now existential verbs. Same thing basically. Existential verbs are verbs we do to ourselves, and to do an existential verb, we don't need to involve anything else or anybody else, we just need ourselves. The difference is, to do an existential verb, we don't even have to move. The prototypical existential verb is to be. This one is probably going to sound even weirder than the example with to go did. When we do the verb to be, we do the being, where the subject, and we get the being done to us, where the direct object. It's an existential thing. For example, Jimmy is happy. The subject is Jimmy, the verb is, which comes from to be, then happy is an adjective. This sentence is missing its direct object. But Jimmy is a person, right? And no matter what happens, Jimmy will always be a person. It's an existential thing. So Jimmy is happy, missing direct object, really means Jimmy is a happy person. Yay for Jimmy, and yay for us. No more missing direct object. The direct object is person, or a happy person, which is an article and an adjective attached to a noun. The thing is, it's just so default that with existential verbs, the direct object is the subject. We don't have to say the direct object every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. Now, if Jimmy is actually a dog, that changes everything and nothing. If Jimmy's a dog, then Jimmy will always be a dog, won't he? Again, it's an existential thing. In that case, Jimmy is happy would really mean Jimmy is a happy dog. Now the direct object is dog or a happy dog. I like dogs. Another verb that's commonly used as an existential verb is to seem or to seem to be. It's the same verb, we just use it differently depending on the context. Jimmy seems sad and Jimmy seems to be sad both mean the same thing, and they're both missing their direct objects. But Jimmy is still a person, isn't he? Jimmy will always be a person. So Jimmy seems sad or Jimmy seems to be sad, missing direct object, really mean Jimmy seems to be a sad person. No missing direct object. The direct object is person or a sad person. With existential verbs, we usually omit the direct object because duh, with existential verbs, the direct object is the subject. After bodily movement verbs and existential verbs, most missing direct objects are caused by an ad hoc, random collection of verbs. The reason we omit the direct object is different for each verb. It depends on the logic of that particular verb. For example, when we use the verbs to cry, to cough, and to sneeze, we usually omit the direct object because it's so default that when we cry tears, that when we cough coughs, and that when we sneeze sneezes. We don't have to say tears, cough, and sneeze every single time. The other person will still know what's going on. Unless the context tells us otherwise, Jimmy cried last night, missing direct object, really means Jimmy cried tears last night, no missing direct object. Jimmy coughed in Kimmy's face, missing direct object, really means Jimmy coughed a cough in Kimmy's face, no missing direct object. Not cool, Jimmy. Then Kimmy sneezed in Jimmy's face, missing direct object, really means Kimmy sneezed a sneeze in Jimmy's face, no missing direct object. Nice, Kimmy. As the late great Gorilla Monsoon would say, churnabout is fair play. But we don't always omit the direct object with these verbs. Jimmy cried tears of joy last night. That's something we'd say. Not to mention, in real life, we talk about tears, coughs, and sneezes all the time. So if we don't cry tears, cough coughs, and sneeze sneezes, where do all those tears, coughs, and sneezes come from? Are you starting to see what I see? In reality, for every verb, there's a subject and a direct object. It doesn't matter which language we're using. It doesn't matter if the subject or direct object has been omitted from the sentence. In the real world, once a verb is involved, there's always a subject and there's always a direct object. Which is why I say the terms transitive and intransitive have zero relation to reality. In reality, if there's always a direct object, intransitive verbs can't really be a thing. Now, I wish I could tell you the saga ends here, but I can't. It doesn't. You know how one lie often leads to another? We tell one lie, then to make that one lie work, we have to tell another lie, then another? Well, once the Spanish authority tells us that intransitive verbs are a thing, that sometimes the direct object just disappears into thin air, to make that work with everything else they tell us and everything else we see, they make up some real whoppers. If you and I are driving down the street and you see a house you like, you could point to the house and say any of these 4 sentences. That house is a pretty house. That is a pretty house. That house is pretty. That is pretty. Since you could say all 4 of these sentences in exactly the same situation, that means in this context, they all mean the same thing. They all describe the same reality, just with slightly different words. Because of the way the nomenclature works though, in the first and third sentences, the word that is considered a demonstrative adjective, or as I say, say a demonstrative adjective. But in the second and fourth sentences, the word that is considered a demonstrative pronoun. So when there's a noun after the word that is an adjective. And when there's not a noun after the word that is a pronoun. Even though the situation in reality hasn't changed, only the words in the sentences have changed. Okay, so I assume the same thing happens with the word pretty in the first and second sentences. Since pretty has a noun after it, it's considered an adjective? Yup. Then in the third and fourth sentences, since the word pretty doesn't have a noun after it, it's considered a pronoun? Nope, sorry. In all four of these sentences, the word pretty is considered an adjective. Now, you and I know, in both cases, just because the noun was omitted from the sentence, that doesn't mean the noun magically disappeared in real life. In Spanish, though, because of the whole adjective matching thing, the fact that adjectives have different forms sometimes to match the noun they're attached to in both gender and number, the reality of the situation is even more apparent. In Spanish, that house is a pretty house, a house is always a house, would be esa casa es una casa bonita. It's esa and bonita to match casa, a singular feminine noun, la casa. But as long as we're still talking about a house, just that is pretty would be esa es bonita. It's still esa and bonita to match casa, even though the word casa isn't even in the sentence anymore. That's because it's still there in reality. And that book is a good book would be ese libro es un libro bueno. Now it's ese and bueno to match libro, a singular masculine noun, el libro. But as long as we're still talking about a book, just that is good would be ese es bueno. It's still ese and bueno to match libro, even though libro isn't in the sentence anymore. Because books don't just magically disappear. The book is still there in reality. Unlike the stuff with lo, se, and the subjunctive, unlike the transitive intransitive thing, this inconsistent nomenclature isn't the end of the world. This doesn't really screw us up that much. We do the same thing in both languages, and for some reason our brains handle it okay. But no, wait, that house is pretty. If there's no direct object, not in the sentence and not in reality, and the word pretty is still an adjective, and adjectives are words that tell us more about nouns, where's the noun that pretty tells us more about? Hold that thought. Check out this example. I came across this late one night when I was in the grammar hole. I'll show you what's behind those black boxes in a minute. The shoes look expensive. The subject is the shoes, the verb is look, then expensive is an adjective. This sentence is missing its direct object. And that's because the verb look, from to look, isn't being used the normal way here. Normally, when we look at something, we see it with our eyes. But in this sentence, the shoes aren't looking at anything. The verb to look is being used as an existential verb. This is similar to the example from before with the verb to seem or to seem to be. Remember, Jimmy seems happy and Jimmy seems to be happy, missing direct object. Both really mean Jimmy seems to be a happy person. No missing direct object? Well, now the shoes look expensive is the same thing as the shoes look to be expensive, missing direct object in both. But shoes are always shoes, right? So both these sentences really mean the shoes look to be expensive shoes. No missing direct object. The subject is the shoes, the verb is looks to be, the direct object is expensive shoes. So in my world, the same thing happens no matter what. It doesn't matter if the speaker omits the direct object or doesn't omit the direct object. The subject always does the verb to the direct object. In this example, the adjective expensive always tells us more about the direct object, even when the direct object is missing from the sentence. That's not how the Spanish authority sees things though. Oh no, the shoes look expensive. In their world, there's simply no direct object, not in the sentence, not in reality. But that brings us back to the question from a few minutes ago. If there's no direct object and expensive is still an adjective, and adjectives are words that tell us more about nouns, where's the noun that expensive tells us more about? I now remove the first black box. This big arrow down here that says modifies, that's the Spanish authority telling us in this sentence the adjective expensive actually modifies the subject. Okay, that's kinda true, but only because the subject is shoes and the direct object is also shoes, even though the direct object has been omitted. Let's keep going. I now remove the second black box. They're oddly calling expensive a predicate adjective now. I've never heard of a predicate adjective before, or I subconsciously blocked it out because it's utterly worthless. When talking about grammar, the predicate of a sentence is everything in the sentence that's not part of the subject. I never understood the point of that term. What does it tell us? But right now the point is, expensive is clearly not part of the subject here, so duh, it's a predicate adjective? What's weird is, calling expensive a predicate adjective, an adjective that's not part of the subject, directly contradicts what they tell us down here with the arrow, that the adjective expensive modifies the subject. So according to them, the predicate adjective, the adjective that's not part of the subject, modifies the subject? They're so weird. Let's remove the last black box now. Oh, I see. The predicate adjective expensive, the adjective that's not part of the subject, actually modifies the subject because because the verb look is a magical linking verb, of which I've also never heard of or again subconsciously blocked out. It's not that the speaker simply omitted the direct object from the sentence knowing the other person would still understand them, because that's how it works with existential verbs. Oh no, 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 no. It's because look is now suddenly a special linking verb with special linking powers. Wow. Just wow. Could it be more convoluted? Then, for the record, when the adjective expensive is part of the subject, so the expensive shoes, it's suddenly an attributive adjective, not a predicate adjective. Or maybe they're saying whenever the adjective is attached to the noun, it's an attributive adjective. It doesn't matter. Either way, it's just more delusion. The Spanish authority is straight up dishonest, or they're delusional. I don't see a way around that. I know I've been making up terms too, but I don't claim that bodily movement verbs or existential verbs have special powers in some sentences, but not in others. In fact, it's the exact opposite. I only made up those terms in the first place so it'd be easier for you to see why we tend to omit the direct object when using a verb in those two groups. To make it easier for you to see that no matter what happens in the sentence, the same thing happens in reality. The subject does the verb to the direct object. No inconsistent nomenclature, no convoluted nomenclature, no magic. This all reminds me of a physics video I saw on YouTube recently. I guess when asked the question, when we roll a ball, why does the ball eventually stop rolling? Aristotle would have answered, because the ball gets tired. And people believed that for thousands of years, until Isaac Newton came along and showed us that an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. With the ball, I think that unbalanced force is friction. Now, I don't mean to compare myself to Isaac Newton here, but I most certainly do intend to compare the Spanish authority to Aristotle. In their world, balls stop rolling because they get tired. Nouns just magically disappear. And when the nouns disappear, all the other words in a sentence suddenly become transformers. If it ended there, if they had just told us a few things that weren't entirely true, lo has so many meanings, se does so many things, there are so many causes of the subjunctive. If they had just pushed a little fantasy on us and left it at that, because it's a predicate adjective, because it's a linking verb, I wouldn't have to make this video. But that's not where it ends. That's not all they do. When we're confused by what they tell us because it doesn't match what we see in reality, and we ask them a question, rarely do they add the context that makes what they said true. They usually just repeat the same thing again, like a robot would, as if that's not what prompted our question in the first place. In last year's State of the Gringo address, I spoke about the subjunctive for 10 minutes. I talked about the causes and triggers, the acronyms, similar to what we discussed in this video. But shortly after posting that video, some teacher still swooped in on Facebook and left a comment that just said, emotions, doubt, cause and effect. Thanks, lady, I hadn't thought of that. When I pointed out that we see sentences all the time conveying emotion, doubt, and cause and effect, but no subjunctive, she replied, well, I've been a Spanish teacher for 25 years, blah, blah, blah. And that's the best we've got. That's the best you've got? After 25 years? I didn't say that. I just asked her, you didn't watch the video, did you? No. Uh-huh. And I don't know how many times I've been there when a student asked why a particular sentence doesn't contain a direct object, and the answer they got was, because the verb is intransitive. Oh my God. That tells us nothing. That's circular logic. The Spanish authority says a verb is intransitive when the sentence doesn't contain a direct object. So telling us a certain sentence doesn't contain a direct object because the verb is intransitive is like saying, that sentence doesn't contain a direct object because it doesn't contain a direct object. Thanks, teach. Circular logic aside, in general, the more nomenclature an answer contains, the worse the answer is. When a student asks me why a particular sentence doesn't contain a direct object, I don't include the terms bodily movement verb or existential verb in my answer unless I'm 100% certain the other person knows what those terms mean. Even then, I still help them see the logic of why that sentence doesn't contain a direct object. That for whatever reason, consciously or subconsciously, the speaker omitted the direct object from their sentence. Maybe because it's so duh that people are people, dogs are dogs, or shoes are shoes, or that we cry tears, cough coughs, and sneeze sneezes. Whatever the specific reason is, I help them see that. Because once we can see the logic of what's happening in one sentence, we not only understand the logic of what's happening in that sentence, we also understand the logic of what's happening in every sentence like it. You know the expression, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime? Does that apply here? I feel like it does. I wanted to. But it's not just teachers. If it were just teachers that told us stuff that isn't true and pushed their fantasy world on us, I probably still wouldn't be making this video right now. Over the last 18 months, as I went through online forums and Facebook groups hunting down the answers to my grammar questions, interacting with people, I couldn't help but notice the people who said stuff like, because the verb is intransitive, most of the time, they weren't teachers. Most of the time, they were one of us, a fellow gringo, a fellow Spanish learner. So first, we accept their simple statements devoid of all context as the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Then, without any bad intentions, we do it because we want to help, we spread the delusion to others. We're stuck in a cycle. First, we're the students, then we become the teachers. We are the teachers. The teachers are us. And when I say we, I'm not just being diplomatic. This is so embarrassing. Promise not to judge me? In the past, when somebody asked me about se, I would tell them, oh, se is so complicated. There are so many ses. Se does so many different things. I used to say what they say. And this one really makes me want to puke. I remember saying on at least one occasion, oh, it's hard to explain what the subjunctive even is. The subjunctive is just a feeling. And most of the time, it's not teachers that freak out and start arguing with me when I say the dictionary follows us, we don't follow the dictionary. I know that's not what we've been led to believe or what we're used to hearing, but it's true. Think about it. When enough of us use a new word, the dictionary adds that new word. When enough of us use an old word a new way, the dictionary adds that new definition. And when enough of us stop using a word, the dictionary eventually drops that word. The dictionary follows us, we don't follow it. Don't shoot the messenger? Plus, even if we did follow the dictionary, which one would we follow? There are so many dictionaries out there, each containing different words, and often they even have different definitions for the same words. Don't get me wrong, I love me a dictionary. I even married a dictionary once. Long story. But reality is reality. The dictionary is an awesome resource. It tells us the most common ways people currently use the most common words. But it's just a guide. It's not the word of God. Talking about the dictionary reminds me of the can-may crowd. My buddy Chris sent me this meme the other day, probably just to rile me up. Mission accomplished. Can I borrow a pencil? I don't know. Can you? We've all been there, right? The teacher wanted the student to say may instead of can. A link to the meme is in the description, but in short, the student gave a great retort, to which the teacher gave what I can only assume they thought was an even better one. I wouldn't have let the teacher off the hook so easily though. Even if words did have specific set meanings, they don't. And even if we did follow the dictionary, we don't. All the dictionaries I've ever checked specifically define the word can as to have the physical ability to do something or to have permission to do something. Even though, in this case, the dictionary supports me, it still doesn't matter. We don't follow the dictionary follows us. What matters is, in the real world, in current times, polite, educated, well-spoken people use the word can both ways. And that's because to have the physical ability to do something and to have permission to do something are both just two slightly different ways of saying the same thing, to be able to. That's the central core idea that the verb can represents. And that's why, in Spanish, the verb poder, which means to be able to, can mean, or may mean, to have the physical ability to do something or to have permission to do something. Now, even though that meme involved a teacher, in my experience, most of the time somebody pulls the can-may thing on us, it's not a teacher. Again, it's one of us. When I talked about the subjunctive in last year's State of the Gringo address, I used this example. I don't know if I can eat anymore. This sentence is confusing because in Spanish, it can be translated with the subjunctive or without the subjunctive. And the reason is, in the real world, we use the verb can two different ways. At least two different ways. When can means to have the physical ability to do something, I don't know if I can eat anymore is translated with the subjunctive. No sé si pueda comer más. Pueda is a subjunctive conjugation of poder. But when can means to have permission to do something, I don't know if I can eat anymore is translated without the subjunctive. No sé si puedo comer más. Puedo is a normal conjugation of poder. But after I posted that video, I got an email from a student saying that can mean allowed to. Well, that's not quite correct. May is allowed to, can is able to. Small distinction. Now I kinda know this lady, she's a nice lady, but come on, when somebody asks me why that sentence can be translated with or without the subjunctive, am I supposed to tell them, I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, one of those translations is illegal? What's sad is, when we go around incorrectly correcting people like this, we're not so different from cheaters. When one student copies all of another student's answers on a test, if they get all the answers right, it's harder to detect that somebody cheated. But if they don't get all the answers right, so they even have the same wrong answers, it's pretty obvious one of them cheated. What I'm saying is, unless everybody that does the can-may thing all come separately to the same wrong conclusion, they're a bunch of cheater, pumpkin eater, incorrect correctors. And what's a cheater again? That's right, a cheater is somebody who mindlessly repeats somebody else's answer without putting any thought into the topic themselves. Sound familiar? At times, we can all be copycat cheater, incorrect correctors. I promise this video isn't just about me complaining. In a few minutes, we'll get to the plan and the solutions. But it's a plan and solutions for a problem. We have a problem. We have to admit that. It's tricky. I'm telling you, stop. We too easily believe what people tell us. But then I'm also saying, stop. We too easily doubt what people tell us. It depends on the context. What can I say? Reality is complicated. If learning is giving context to new information as we encounter it, then we're really bad at learning. If context is reality, then we're really bad at seeing reality. We're constantly accepting these these simple statements or one single perspective as the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Sometimes we give automatic credibility to an authority figure. We assume the shoe guy is a shoe expert. Other times we accept contextual if-then statements without the context, like we do with lo and se and the subjunctive. And sometimes we even accept inconsistent, convoluted, I'm sorry, but delusional nomenclature. That is a pretty house. That is pretty, telling us that in the second example, there's no direct object, so is must be a magical linking verb, is like finding a dinosaur skeleton without the leg bones and concluding that it must be a magical flying dinosaur, even though somebody else just found the same skeleton last week with the leg bones and it was classified as a normal, not flying dinosaur. Yay or nay on the analogy? As far as accepting the delusion and giving automatic credibility to authority, I think we mainly do it because we're lazy. I'm actually serious this time. It's human nature or something. It would be so tiring to have to constantly think about all the context of every statement, or all the different hypothetical perspectives in a situation. It beats me though why we're so willing to repeat the same stuff they repeat to us, even though we know we have no clue what we're talking about. I used to say the same stuff they say about set and the subjunctive. That's so embarrassing. And I have no clue why we're so willing to play the role expected of us, even when we know we have no idea what we're doing, like I did at the shoe store that night, though not as embarrassing as the set and subjunctive thing. And as authority figures, when somebody is confused by what we tell them or has a question, we often just repeat the same thing to them again. And as students, we keep going back to the same source for help. Would we keep going to that same shoe guy for the same shoe test if we always came home with blisters? Oh wait, I'm the shoe guy. I kept going back to those same subjunctive causes, triggers, and acronyms, even though they confused the bejeebers out of me. They never made any sense. It was different than with ser versus a star and por versus para and all the other hard stuff. I didn't consider for a second that intransitive verbs weren't really a thing, even though all the evidence was there. I just kept trying to understand what these people were talking about when they told me because the verb is intransitive. Again, mainly because I was lazy. I never went back to the grammar. I never took a closer look myself. I never put in the work. Until I did. I hope you're starting to see this isn't one big us versus them thing. This isn't just good guys versus bad guys. Okay, that's kinda sorta what this is, but the two sides are fluid. Sometimes we're us, but sometimes we're them. Sometimes we're the good guys, but sometimes we're the bad guys. People ask me all the time, who is the Spanish authority? I've never answered that question before. I'm gonna answer it right now though. I'm gonna take off the Spanish authority's mask and reveal to the world who is responsible for such pure evilness. People think it's the dictionary. Is it the dictionary? Things get a little weird when I show them this picture. No, the dictionary isn't the Spanish authority. The dictionary is our friend, our abused friend. When we mindlessly repeat to others what was mindlessly repeated to us, even though we know we have no clue what we're talking about, even though we know we've put zero thought into the topic ourselves, and even though it's not true, when we stop people mid-sentence to incorrectly correct them, when somebody is confused or asks a question and we keep repeating the same thing over and over, what I'm saying is, the dictionary, no. The grammar book, yes. The grammar book, yes. Our teachers, yes. Every last one of them. You, unless you're unlike every human I've ever met in my entire life, then yes, yes you. And me? Yes. Sometimes even I'm the Spanish authority. We're all the Spanish authority. There is no Spanish authority. I use that term mockingly. The dictionaries and grammar books all follow us. We don't follow them. Even the Royal Academy of whatever, they follow us too. Or actually, they follow native Spanish speakers. Wouldn't be a good idea to follow us. But when Spanish speakers start speaking a different way, the Royal Academy of whatever will eventually reflect that change. What's going on is, we've all heard it before, language is this living thing. And sure, it's living or not, whatever. But what's definitely true is, we're living, and we're all different, and we all use language differently. Language is constantly changing and morphing according to billions of living human beings. So any attempt to dictate how one person speaks or doesn't speak, well, this ain't math. 2 + 2 = 5? That's wrong. That doesn't match reality. But saying I write good instead of I write well, that's not the same thing. Sure, it's wrong, but not really. Both these sentences tell us the same thing about reality. Neither is more effective at transmitting the message than the other. My dad would never say I write good, and when somebody asks him how he's doing, he would never say, I'm good. Luckily for me, my dad takes pride in the way he speaks. But interestingly, I have noticed he has started to say, I'm good in another situation. Like, you want something from the store, Dad? No thanks, I'm good. I'm pretty sure that's a new way of talking, for him and in general. I don't think he would have said that 10 years ago. It started with the youngsters, nah, I'm good. Now even my dad says it. And no, when my dad says I'm good, he's not saying he's well behaved or that he tastes good. And I'm not saying don't try to speak perfectly. Try to speak perfectly. I'm just saying there's no Spanish authority. authority. The dictionaries, the grammar books, the Royal Academy of whatever, and yes, even our teachers, they're not teaching Old English, are they? They all follow us, even though we are the teachers and the teachers are us. You know what I mean. What's weird is they just can't accept it. That's why I mocked them. I was shocked last year when I read that there are actually two different philosophies when it comes to grammar. There's prescriptive grammar and there's descriptive grammar. I was like, no way. Prescriptive grammar explains how certain people think a language should be used or require it to be used, whereas descriptive grammar focuses on how a language is actually used by speakers and writers. I'll let you figure out which side is which. Bottom line, there is no Spanish authority, but unfortunately, it seems like we're all hardwired to accept delusion and spread delusion. And when we do that, we're the bad guys. Sometimes we're all the Spanish authority. This video is about us versus them, but first we need to get our own houses in order. First, it's us versus ourselves. We can do better. We deserve better. They deserve better. It's us versus ourselves. Then we fight, fight, fight. Are you in? You want to talk about God again? Let's talk about God again. I personally don't believe that anybody or anything with intentions is responsible for the world, or the universe, or the multiverse, or whatever. And as is common with non-believers like myself, I used to get upset, hostile, or defensive at the mere mention of God. So recently, when my friend told me how upset she was that her daughter came home from school saying, "Mommy, God created the trees. Mommy, God created the flowers," I kind of felt like the Dalai Lama. I understood why my friend was upset. In the past, that would have pissed me off too. How can they teach that? God didn't make the flowers, the seed, nutrients, water, photosynthesis, blah, blah, blah. But now I know that words don't mean words. Not to mention I've been watching lots of physics videos on YouTube. And it's my understanding that everything on this planet, including flowers, can be traced back to the Big Bang and everything that came from the Big Bang, like stars and stuff. So all the elements on the periodic table, which is what everything is made of, I think, came from the Big Bang. First, that's fun to think about. But second, as far as I know, even the most advanced experts on this stuff don't claim to know what happened at the time of the Big Bang. After the Big Bang, though not right after it, they're both confident and fuzzy about things. It depends on the context, on what specifically we're talking about. But it's my understanding that nobody has even the faintest idea what came before the Big Bang, or what came before that, or before that. You know when somebody combines two foods that don't normally go together, sometimes we say, well, it all goes to the same place. Or is that just my mom? I feel like that kind of works here, like we all end up at the same place. Who or what made the flowers? Yes, the seed, water, photosynthesis, and all that mumbo jumbo, but who or what made the seed, and who or what made that? When we keep digging, when we keep going further back, then what made that? We all end up at the same place. What caused the Big Bang? Nobody knows. And to me, that unknown, infinity, negative infinity, call it whatever you want, the force that created that force, stars keep burning. That's crazy in and of itself. They just keep burning. And we magically go around one. That's insane. Gravity is insane. That's God. Who cares? Don't get me wrong, when we're trying to figure out something specific, we need to be able to test it and verify that it does the same thing every time. We need to be able to predict things and test our predictions. But when a 5-year-old says God made the flowers, as a non-believer myself, I think it's okay to be okay with that and not be a sellout or intellectually dishonest or anything negative. In a way, God did make the flowers. Whatever caused the Big Bang, that's also what made the flowers. And for the record, the seed and all that stuff made the flowers too. God is just a word. Like I said before, it would be so tiring to have to look for all the context in every situation or every perspective possible. I get it. Context is reality, and we can never have all the context. But when there's a meeting of two ideas, when there's confusion, discussion, debate, confrontation, one perspective isn't enough. One perspective is the problem. When there's confusion, discussion, debate, confrontation, it's our job as human beings to have two perspectives, at least two perspectives, two minimum. Now, of course, that's easier said than done sometimes. Our minds are manipulative little things. Our egos and insecurities constantly work to convince us that we're the good guy, that we're right, that the other person is wrong. But we can always find what we're looking for, and once we see something from a certain perspective, it's difficult to see it from any other perspective. Tunnel vision. The only way to fight against that is to fight against it. The best way to battle our propensity to see things only one way is to not just look for how we're wrong, but to love being wrong. I love being wrong. Being wrong is the best. The times I realize I'm wrong about something, those are the only moments in life I can be 100% certain I'm closer to being right. And I love being right even more than I love being wrong. If I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong so I can switch sides and be right next time. My My best strategy for getting conscious and seeing reality better is when two things seem like they're the same, we need to look for how they're different. And when two things seem different, we need to look for how they're the same. In this world, no two things are 100% exactly the same, otherwise they'd be the same thing. So when somebody says that two things are the same, that doesn't mean they're the same in every way, only in the way the speaker is talking about, whatever their point is. But it doesn't mean their comparison is automatically a good one. I'm still curious what you thought of that dinosaur analogy, by the way. This might seem like self-serving advice or advice specific to lots of the topics I talked about in this video, but this kind of thinking is how I figured all that stuff out, that all the different meanings of lo are the same, that there's only one sa, and everything else. They're the same? Great. Now how are they different? Oh, they're different. Awesome. How are they the same? You don't always hit gold, of course. I didn't know I was gonna see any of the stuff I saw, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you see stuff in the grammar and the words are less confusing. Sometimes you see, in a way, God did make the flowers and the world is more peaceful. Namaste. Now I gotta say, I'm still a moron. Ask any of my friends. I say that for two reasons. One, I feel super snobby and like a know-it-all talking like this. But two, more importantly, I don't think I'm open-minded. That's not a thing. Well, it kinda is, but it's a situation-specific thing. Being open-minded, looking for that second perspective, we can practice and get better at it, but it's a never-ending job. The new situations keep popping up, and with the ones that do repeat, we never have all the context. I'm still a moron. I'm just less of a moron than I used to be, but hopefully more of a moron than I'll be tomorrow. This next strategy definitely helps with learning Spanish, and it might help with other stuff too, I'm not sure. When they say something different in Spanish than we say in English, we often ask, why do they say this? Why do they say that? But it's usually more productive to ask, why not? Why wouldn't they or couldn't they say it that way? Even within a language, even using mostly the same words, we can usually say the same thing multiple ways. Jimmy made the pizza was made by Jimmy. Why would somebody say it the second way when they could say it the first way? Well, why not? Both sentences tell us the same thing about the world. Or sometimes, just as good, we can ask ourselves, why do we say it that way in English? I'm not saying these questions are magic buttons, but they do put our minds on the right track. They kind of force us, or at least pressure us, to look for that second perspective. They encourage us to do some investigating, in our minds, in the dictionary, wherever. Somebody recently asked me why they say llegar a la estación de tren when we say arrive at the train station. In Spanish, they use the preposition a, which usually means to, but we use the preposition at. They say arrive to the station, we say arrive at the station. In the past, I would have answered because we use prepositions arbitrarily sometimes. We're all the Spanish authority. And while that might be true sometimes, it's not as true as I once believed it to be. There's usually a logical reason for everything. The key with verbs is to figure out their historical meaning. In Spanish, these days, they do say llegar when we say to arrive, but that's different than its historical meaning. It turns out llegar comes from Latin, and in Latin, llegar basically means to apply, to add, to attach. See what's going on? When we say Jimmy arrives at the train station, they do say Jimmy llega a la estación de tren, but that more literally means Jimmy added himself to the train station, or Jimmy attached himself to the train station. That's why they use a in Spanish with llegar in this context. The cool thing is, arriving at this new perspective, or attaching myself to this new perspective, took me 1 minute. I just typed etymology llegar into the Google search box. I don't like saying the word etymology though. It's impossible to say without sounding snobby. That's why I say the history of llegar. But when searching, it's better to use the word etymology. When there's confusion, discussion, debate, confrontation, whether it's about God or a Spanish sentence, one perspective isn't enough. And we can't rely on the other person or anybody else. It's on us. We must look for that second perspective ourselves, whether we're the student with the confusion or the teacher in charge of clearing it away. If we want it, we gotta do the work, in school and in life. Okay, enough woo-woo. In my world, we practice descriptive grammar, not prescriptive grammar. In my world, I describe for you how people actually speak, not slang and that stuff. Most Spanish books, classes, and courses only talk about grammar and vocab, but there are 3 pieces to the language puzzle, not 2. There's grammar and vocab, then there's logic. In my world, subjects do verbs to direct objects. That's the framework of every sentence. Don't get me wrong, there's more going on than what I've shown you in this video. We barely talked about indirect objects, prepositions, or conjunctions. But this subject-verb direct object thing still holds. Of course, some sentences contain more than one clause, they have more than one verb, but in those sentences, in reality, each verb has a subject and each verb has a direct object. The cool thing is, with multiple clause sentences, when we fill in any missing context, so the sentences fit the framework, subjects do verbs to direct objects, when we rewrite multiple clause sentences in the language of reality, we don't need to use all the complicated nomenclature the Spanish authority uses. Instead of saying noun clause, adjective clause, adverbial clause, and there are way more, we just say clause, or actually main clause and not main clause. Nice and simple. The thing is, with multiple clause sentences, the only way to see what's really going on is to look at them 2 different ways, from 2 different perspectives. Sound familiar? We have to see what's going on in each clause and in the whole sentence, all the clauses together. In our sentences, we combine clauses, we embed clauses, we do all kinds of stuff. In my premium course, Logical Spanish, I call this Camera 1, Camera 2. When we're looking at the whole sentence, it's like a wide-angle camera shot where you can see the whole scene, the whole football game or whatever. Then, when we're looking at the individual clauses, it's like the zoomed-in shots where you can see just one player or a couple players. It'd be hard to follow the game without both views. I already told you about the Spanish quickies I have coming. First, a series on the parts of speech, then a series on phrases, clauses, and sentences. Do you see why now? It's all about that strong foundation. And all those videos will be in English. We're in this situation in the first place because we don't know how English really works. We need to know how English works because we're learning Spanish in English. We're constantly comparing Spanish sentences to English sentences and asking why. The Spanish authority usually tells us that's just how it is. Now I'm telling you there's almost always a logical reason for everything. Even though those videos will be in English, I bet you'll have at least one aha moment in each. To make sure you don't miss any of my future videos, sign up for the Spanish Dude newsletter at SpanishDude.com/newsletter. Then my premium course, Logical Spanish, picks up where the Spanish quickies leave off, with the actual Spanish. Language is a three-piece puzzle: grammar, vocab, logic, and Logical Spanish covers all three. We start with nouns, then verbs, then adjectives, and so on. It's a very organized course. Go in there, press play on the first video, then follow my instructions, video 2, video 3, etc. With my free videos, I give you the gist of everything, but in Logical Spanish, we go way beyond the gist. Like with adjectives, on YouTube, I have a couple videos on adjectives. In Logical Spanish, there are 2 entire modules on adjectives, about 15 videos. I cover adjective placement, adjective matching, the numbers, possessive adjectives, demonstrative adjectives. I address the big before-after question. When do we put the adjective before the noun, and when do we put the adjective after the noun? What's the difference between un buen chico and un chico bueno? That's something I didn't know until last year. In Logical Spanish, I'm covering everything a normal grammar book or Spanish course covers, my way of course, but then we also go over the logic of it all, how to get to the language of reality no matter what the words in a sentence tell us. If you're a lifetime member, you already have access to Logical Spanish. Just sign into the premium course area and you'll see it right away. If you're not a lifetime member, you can become one right now at SpanishDude.com/lifetime, or you can enroll in just the Logical Spanish course at SpanishDude.com/logical. All these links are below this video or in the description. Okay, last thing, the big issues. Once you really know how the parts of speech work and how they work together, I'm going to do a third series of Spanish quickies on just the big issues. Ser versus estar, preterite versus imperfect, ser versus estar in the past, por versus para, le versus lo versus se, and the subjunctive. Even the ones I've already covered, I'm going to cover again with fresh eyes. And along with each big issue video, there will be what I'm calling a reality check worksheet. If you're a teacher and can't just order new books, you can print out these reality check worksheets and put them in the right spot in the current book. When you're talking about se, you can give the students the reality check worksheet on se or on object pronouns. The reality check worksheets will contain the context that makes all the stuff the book says true. It'll show them how all the different ses, while definitely different, are the same. That way they see all the different situations we use se in, important, but also get the context that connects all those different ses logically, also important. And there will be versions of every reality check worksheet without any branding. No name, no website, no email, just a white paper with writing that, as a teacher, I'm assuming you can hand out to your students or insert in the textbook. So that's the deal. If you've tried to learn Spanish before and quit, try again. If you were just lazy and didn't do any work, that's on you. But if you ever encountered a sentence where you knew all the words and you knew all the grammar, but still didn't understand how it all went together or how to put it all together, look again with fresh eyes. And speaking of fresh eyes, if you made it this far, thank you. I say I speak your language, but if you're still here, that's only because you speak my language. We're all always delusional, but at least you and I both want to speak the language of reality. That's a good start. But now it's time. Does the ball stop rolling because it gets tired, or is it because of friction? Do nouns just disappear from thin air, or are they always really there? When you're ready, I want you to walk out into this big, beautiful world of ours. Look around, talk to people, watch movies, read books, listen to music, focus on the words, take them all in with fresh eyes. Then, only when you're ready, I want you to tell me, message me, leave me a comment, tell me, whose world do you live in? Theirs or mine?